I'd like to ask the committee to come to order. I will now also recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of delivering an open statement. Today marks our 5th hearing in this Congress on the Toxic Substances Control Act. Our focus today is on 2 sections in TSCA dedicated to getting EPA relevant testing data and other information on chemical substances in United States commerce. Past application of Section 4 by the EPA to obtain information about existing chemicals has been frustrated by judicial interpretation. We need to push beyond relitigating those cases and focus on what authorities EPA has now or could reasonably use in the future to produce tailored, necessarily and high-quality test data and other information to carry out TSCA. We'll also pick up on the discussion from the last hearing on standards for data quality and the use of the best available science. The goal is credible decisions using high-quality data. Information management will be one of the toughest areas to get right, but it's also one of the most important. I want to remind everyone that last summer, former TSCA Program Director Charlie Auer testified before our committee that simply improving the way EPA is able to get information under Section 4 would have profound impacts on improving TSCA's overall operation. Let's not kid ourselves, though. Information collection and analysis on thousands of chemicals will become time-consuming and very expensive. EPA will have to be smart and efficient to make this program work, especially when it comes to using available information, particularly exposure history, in deciding whether more testing is needed and who should do the testing. Today's hearing will also focus on reporting for the thousands of chemicals in commerce. Section 8 requires EPA to develop and maintain an inventory of all chemicals or categories of chemicals that are manufactured or processed in the United States. It also gives EPA authority to require certain businesses involved with a chemical substance to maintain records and submit health and safety information reports, particularly adverse health incidents caused by the chemical to the EPA. Within these reporting requirements, there are exemptions for polymers, microorganisms, and naturally occurring substances. We should find out if these make sense and should be continued, and what the incremental gain, if any, in public health, resources, or protection occurs without these exemptions. We also need to focus on the definition of processor and whether the definition is right-sized to the persons, activities, and information EPA is receiving. With that, I want to welcome our witnesses and thank them for their expertise and candor. We expect them to provide a variety of perspectives on when testing should be required and what we can do to improve testing techniques so we can speed up analysis and reduce use of animals in that testing. We look forward to their views. And before I yield to the ranking member, I want to go off script and also thank you. I think in our questions and response, candor is going to be important. There's a lot of excitement in trying to move a bill and move it properly. And the other thing is I was going back into the records, and I think 1976 is when this was authorized and put into law. And I had just graduated high school at that time and started my first year in college. So suffice it to say that probably a review and update of this law is timely, but we have to do it right. A lot of you all here will help us muddle through that process and point out the good and the bad and the ugly, and maybe with working with my colleagues we can find areas of compromise. With that, I'd like to yield to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, and thank you for holding this hearing on the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. This is the subcommittee's 5th hearing, as we've been told, on this program. The hearings have been very instructive and are providing us with a good foundation from which to evaluate the current law and to develop legislation to improve it. Reform of this legislation is long overdue. I hope, Mr. Chair, that we will be able to work together and find common ground in this effort, which I think is critically important. The two sections of TSCA that we are focusing on today, Section 4 on chemical testing and Section 8 on information reporting and retention, have not provided sufficient reliable information to support assessment and regulation of chemicals. The authorities provided to EPA in these sections are weak and cumbersome to implement. As a result, there is too little information gathered on the toxicity or environmental risks associated with chemicals. And the inventory of chemicals in commerce does not provide sufficiently detailed and contemporary data on the chemicals being used in the United States. Currently, the burden is on EPA to demonstrate that information is needed rather than on industry to provide the information to demonstrate that their product has been adequately tested and will present little risk when used properly. The tragic situation in Charleston, West Virginia demonstrates several failings of our chemical safety laws. Not all aspects of this incident can be blamed on the faults with TSCA, but the lack of information needed to respond to this situation illustrates the failure of this law. When the water supply for the people of Charleston, West Virginia was contaminated with chemicals that leaked from a storage tank, there was little reliable information to provide the public, emergency responders, or to the water company to guide their response actions. As a result, there is public confusion and concern about the advice offered by public officials and the water company. There is little understanding of the fate of the chemical in the water supply or what health or environmental effects might result from the spill. This illustrates the importance of having adequate information to inform decisions about the protection of human health and our environment. Reform of TSCA must result in better information and clear authority for EPA to act. The agency must have sufficient information to evaluate the risks of chemicals currently on the market, and basic information should be available before we have an accident, not slapped together in the midst of a crisis. The agency must be able to assess the risk of new chemicals before they enter into commerce. Dr. Paulson informs us in his testimony that a substantial portion of chemicals are known to have a wide range of adverse and mostly irreversible effects on child health. That's a prime warning. So it is important that we move forward with a law that recognizes that fact and offers adequate protections for everyone. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses today, and I thank you all for being here to share your views on what is a very important topic. And again, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
I thank my colleague. Now, the Chair recognizes the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we are going to continue our examination of TSCA with a focus on the nuts and bolts of chemical information. For sure, we want to develop a system for chemical regulation that is the gold standard for the rest of the world. It doesn't mean the most precautionary or the most commercially freewheeling. It means a balanced system rooted in the best science and highest quality information so that all of us can be confident that if the chemical is in our stream of commerce, it's safe and commerce flows freely across state lines and across borders. The foundation of that confidence should be information, and that information must be grounded in rigorous science available for everyone to review, organized by category, and backed up by state-of-the-art testing when needed. The technology of testing has vastly advanced since 1976, and it will continue to evolve in a positive way. High-power computers will simulate and sort exposure data and analyze chemicals in batches by category, so that time spent testing for biological effects and need to test on live organisms is, in fact, reduced. We've also got to make sure that we don't go overboard and become obsessed with data collection for its own sake. There are thousands of chemicals in everyday life that are understood to pose no unreasonable risk when used as intended. We need to identify those based on information that we already have. Then we can focus our resources and information development on the ones that we aren't so sure about. It's often said that the job of the manager is to know when to stop taking data and start making decisions. That's the challenge for EPA under Reform TSCA. It's also the challenge that we on the committee face as we transition from our examination of current law to developing our own ideas for how to modernize, after nearly 4 decades, this body of regulation. So I look forward to working with every one of our committee members as we set on that path. And I have every confidence in you, Mr. Shimkus, to chart a successful course to get this job done. Really, I do. And I also appreciate the leadership of Mr. Waxman and Mr. Tonko and every member of this subcommittee for the hard work that they've put in. We need to chart a path that, yes, not only will reach the House floor, but ultimately reaches the President, and it needs to happen this year. All of us have stayed focused through these hearings and developed the policy expertise that will benefit each of us in our deliberations. It's hard work that attracts little publicity, but in the long run, our world is certainly going to be better for it, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. I want to make sure I get that clip and send it to my spouse so that
Yeah.
she knows that I'm
And
working.
your high school science teacher.
That's right. No, I don't want to go there. Now, and this will be the first of many times that we get to recognize the ranking member, but being the first one, I want to congratulate Henry on his announcement. I don't expect him to go away quietly. I do expect involvement after Congress still with us and our issues, but with that, let me yield 5 minutes to the ranking member and Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to also give you a clip that you can share with your family, because I agree with Chairman Upton. This is a time for us to work together, and I want to work with you on reform of the Toxic Substances Control Act. I believe TSCA is a flawed law that must be updated, and we need to work together to do this. Last month, state and federal officials in West Virginia were left scrambling when they could not find meaningful health and safety data on a chemical that had polluted the drinking water of 300,000 people. This disaster illustrated some serious problems with the current law. New chemicals enter the market without basic toxicity data. Untested chemicals remain on the market, and chemical manufacturers often are not required to submit tests that they do are not required to submit tests that they do to EPA. This is an area ripe for congressional action, and holding a series of hearings is a step in the right direction. But we also need to start bipartisan talks to see if we can reach a compromise that protects the public from dangerous toxic chemicals without unduly burdening industry. It's an open secret that the majority staff is drafting a TSCA bill, but at this point, they've shared nothing with the staff on our side of the aisle. They haven't shown us language or explained their concepts for TSCA reform. Of course, Mr. Chairman, this is your prerogative, but the reality is that an unbalanced proposal simply isn't going to become law. The Senate also has drafted a proposal for TSCA reform. The chemical industry strongly supports it, but the public interest community is deeply concerned about the proposal. We need to strengthen TSCA, yet most environmental groups believe that the Senate draft would actually weaken the current law. This looks like a recipe for a stalemate. And we don't need too many recipes for a stalemate. We get stalemates all the time without a recipe. If we're going to succeed, however, in reaching a compromise that will become law, we need a formulation that both sides, industry and environmentalists, can support. And I think there's a way we can achieve this. It's not commonly known, but in 2011, the American Chemistry Council, representing industry, and the Safer Chemicals Healthy Family Coalition, representing public health groups, sat down to see if they could find common ground on TSCA reform. They found many areas of agreement and documented the agreement in a memorandum prepared by the Meridian Institute. I believe this consensus between industry and public health groups could be a basis for productive discussions in this committee. Later today, I'll be sending a letter to these groups requesting they share their results with our committee. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to invite you to join me in sending this letter. The results of their careful policy discussions just might be a blueprint for success in our committee. In recent days, I've been asked a lot about my views of Congress, particularly since I announced I'm leaving. Now people want to know what I think about Congress. Well, I've said that although there are aspects of Congress today that I strongly dislike, I remain convinced that Congress can still be a powerful force for good for our nation. I hope we can demonstrate that once again by working together on TSCA reform. Only when we work together do we see successful legislation all the way through to the President's signature. That's what we need to do, initiate successful legislation in this committee and see it all the way through. We have a history of that in our committee, and I hope we could go back to that pattern again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Now, again, the chair, I'd like to welcome you all here. You'll all be given 5 minutes for your opening statement. Your full statements will be recorded into the record. So we'll start from left to right. We'll start with Mr. Charles Drevna, President of the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and Full Committee Chair Mr. Upton and Mr. Waxman, members of the subcommittee. I'm Charlie Drevna, President of American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. As the name implies, AFPM represents high-tech manufacturers. While most people are familiar with the fuels they use every day, many are not familiar with the petrochemicals. Petrochemicals are the industrial building blocks that make the materials, ingredients, and processing agents that appear throughout a variety of manufacturing supply chains, whether it's the plastic casing your cell phone, excuse me, or the aspirin in your medicine chest, or even the helmet worn by a loved one in the military. Petrochemicals such as ethylene and propylene play a critical role in manufacturing and in our lives every day. TSCA is a unique statute in that it has much to do with commerce and the manufacturing supply chain as it does with health, human health, and the environment. TSCA gives EPA broad power to regulate chemicals in commerce. While AFPM supports rational modernization of TSCA, great care must be taken so that the manufacturing supply chains are not disrupted. This is one statute where our members believe that a strong federal role is required to maintain the interstate flow of raw materials and goods. Since its enactment in 1976, we've learned that the implementation of TSCA has been challenging for EPA in certain areas, and there is still debate over whether the challenges have been due to the statute or due to some of the choices the agency has made. I believe it's time to take a fresh look at how we control chemicals in commerce and again try to strike that balance between health and the environment and a globally competitive manufacturing supply chain. The U.S. is on the brink of a manufacturing renaissance, due in large part to dramatic reductions in the cost of energy and raw materials. Shale development has fostered the most globally competitive positioning for American manufacturers I've ever witnessed. Given this opportunity, when it comes to laws that affect the feedstocks driving the manufacturing renaissance, we must get TSCA modernization right. To begin, AFPM supports a bipartisan effort to modernize TSCA. That means a new starting point for discussion and a constructive dialogue. I echo Mr. Waxman's comments there. The current TSCA statute provides a solid backbone for chemical regulation, but AFPM does see room for improvement. One area for improvement is more guidance from Congress that directs EPA to prioritize chemicals in commerce. AFPM views prioritization efforts under the Canadian Chemical Management Program as a reasonable, achievable model. The approach used in Canada is a screening-level look at chemical hazard and exposure that tells scientists whether or not more work is needed to deem a substance safe for its intended use and the conditions of that use. Currently, the EPA has a sophisticated and protective models that it uses to evaluate the potential hazards of chemicals. The agency collects data under the Chemical Data Reporting Rule to determine the exposure potential of chemical substances. So there are no technical or practical reasons that EPA cannot prioritize chemicals for further work. Congress should also include provisions that increase scientific quality and transparency at the agency. Specific language should require EPA to develop criteria by which the agency and public can judge the quality of scientific studies under consideration, as well as EPA risk assessments. An important part of TSCA is Section 4, which authorizes EPA to require laboratory testing of certain chemicals. I tend to agree that under Section 4, the prerequisite for EPA to find a risk posed by a chemical before it can require testing for that chemical does not make sense. The exposure finding, on the other hand, is a built-in check and balance to prevent EPA from demanding unreasonable animal-intensive tests that will not lead to a further and better understanding of safety. AFPM firmly believes that there should be an exposure basis before EPA can require animal testing. AFPM's highest level principles state that TSCA should be a tiered, targeted, and risk-based approach. This is especially true for testing and data collection. A tiered approach begins with the use of existing information, protective models, and structure-activity relationships. If there is an unreasonable amount of scientific uncertainty at a screening level, then the substance would be subject to the next tier in which information is collected to reduce the uncertainty. When it comes to Section 8, which authorizes EPA to collect information that provides an accurate reflection of chemicals in commerce, Congress should also provide specific guidance. For example, the Chemical Data Reporting Rule, EPA is required for producers to use exposure information. In closing, there are other sections of TSCA that may need updating, but I'm confident that the subcommittee will address those issues at a later date. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Tomko, and the subcommittee members for allowing us the opportunity to express our views.
Thank you, Mr. Drevin. Now the chair recognizes Mr. Robert Matthews from McKenna, Long, and Aldridge on behalf of the Consumer Specialty Products Association. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Tomko, members of the committee. It's a pleasure and privilege to appear before this committee on behalf of the Consumer Specialty Products Association. It is our firm's oldest client. We've been representing their interests for over 5 decades. So it is my privilege to appear on their behalf and before your subcommittee. In fact, this year CSPA celebrates its 100-year anniversary serving as the premier trade association representing the interests of companies both large and small. A good half of their companies are small businesses, the companies that formulate and market household and institutional products. In our written testimony and in my comments today, we refer to our members as formulators, which is a segment of the downstream companies that are more generally referred to as processors. CSPA and its member companies have consistently advocated for the need to update the TSCA statute and, importantly, recognize the role of downstream formulators in that process. CSPA's role and interest in TSCA is to assure the process is working in a way that protects public health and the environment, allows companies to continue to operate effectively and efficiently in commerce, and maximizes consumer confidence in chemical safety and, by extension, in the branded products that we place on the market. CSPA's support for modernizing TSCA is rooted in 3 principal considerations. First, it's critical, as I just mentioned, that consumers have confidence in these formulated products. Maintaining that high level of confidence in the safety of chemicals used in their products placed on the market is of utmost concern to CSPA and its member companies. Second, CSPA member companies who sell formulated household and institutional products increasingly face a multitude of state regulations, indeed not only at the state but at the local level, as legislative and regulatory entities are simply not waiting for Congress to act to modernize this statute. So we support modernization because it will create a more predictable environment in which companies can engage in interstate commerce. And finally, among the reasons we have continually supported changes to and a modernization of TSCA is because our companies, like others in industry, are impacted by the adoption and globalization of the EU REACH program, with its focus on regulation by hazardous properties of chemicals, and its calls for massive data into the system that is often unnecessary, costly, and burdensome. We think this is an opportunity for the United States to assert its leadership in establishing risk-based global chemical management programs. So I'm now, with that background, pleased to share with you our very specific thoughts on how CSPA and its member companies can meaningfully participate in the TSCA statute that would emerge after modernization. So we have focused in particular on the issues that impact our members. Those include, in particular, one that is before this committee today, that is Section 8 and the reporting provisions thereunder. We've also focused considerable attention on the confidential business information, or CBI, provisions of Section 14. So I will largely focus on Section 8, as this committee has requested, and the impact of that section on the prioritization program under Section 4. Key to modernize TSCA is an affirmation of a risk-based chemical management system, meaning that at the time that EPA is prioritizing chemicals for review and setting standards, they are focused not only on the hazard or intrinsic properties of that chemical, but the manner in which those chemicals are used and the potential exposures that they create. But as it supports a risk-based approach, CSPA has also recognized 3 related points. First, indeed, a risk-based system starts with prioritization, where EPA screens chemicals in commerce to identify which ones should be subject to further review and potentially to a safety assessment. Given the large number of chemicals in process, it is imperative that there be an effective screening process. Second, to properly screen and indeed, again, potentially to conduct risk assessments, EPA must have information on how those chemicals are being used and their potential exposure scenarios that they create. And that leads to the third point, which is EPA has to have the means to get that information from where that information lies, which is principally with the downstream community, who know much more about use and exposure than do the raw material manufacturers. So the role of formulators under a revised TSCA, therefore, can be very much defined and targeted for that purpose. We have spent considerable time focusing on the elements that would be useful in that regard, that would impact our member companies. So we have done so in a manner that aligns what we think is EPA's needs at the prioritization stage with the information that we have. So we would propose to submit to the agency information that involves chemicals we place in products, information on chemicals that are placed in products intended for use by children, information on the concentration range of the chemicals in those products, and indeed the number of workers, that is, who are involved in formulating those materials. Combined with the hazard materials, that is to say the hazard information that EPA would have from the chemical producers, this would give EPA all that it needs in regard to prioritization. So I have much more to say about confidential business information. Perhaps that will come up, but that is the principal focus of our efforts, is to get that kind of use and exposure information into the agency. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the chair recognizes Dr. Brent Grasman, Vice President for Quality Assurance, Via Systems Group, Incorporated, on behalf of the IPC, Association Connecting Electronics and Industries, and more importantly, from the St. Louis metropolitan area, which is where I reside. So with that, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the opportunity to address you today. Via Systems is a global manufacturer of printed circuit boards. We're headquartered, as the chairman mentioned, in St. Louis. We employ over 2,000 people in the U.S. in 8 different factories, including North Jackson, Ohio, and Littleton, Colorado. We make printed circuit boards that are used by leading manufacturers of transportation, telecommunications, medical, defense, and aerospace products. I'm also here to represent IPC, the Association Connecting Electronics Industries. IPC is a global trade association representing over 2,000 electronics manufacturers in the U.S. As a member of IPC's Government Relations Committee, I want to emphasize that IPC and its members, including Via Systems, are all strong advocates for science-based regulation that improves the environment, protects human health, and stimulates the economy. In my testimony, I'll highlight our concerns about TSCA Section 8 as it applies to byproducts reporting. It's critical that Congress reform TSCA in a way that directs the Environmental Protection Agency to focus and prioritize its regulation of chemicals. Selection of priority chemicals should be based on sound science. Substances that exhibit the greatest hazard and pose the greatest exposure to consumers should be given priority for review, for testing, and as needed for regulation. A targeted, prioritized approach will allow the EPA and industry to both more effectively use our limited resources to protect human health and the environment. An example of EPA's failure to prioritize chemical regulation is the treatment of byproducts. Under TSCA, the EPA treats byproducts as new chemicals if they're sent for recycling. But if we send them for disposal, there's no TSCA requirement invoked. As a new chemical, the byproduct sent for recycling must be listed on the TSCA inventory and is subject to the full regimen of TSCA record keeping, reporting, and enforcement. Let me emphasize, All of these regulatory obligations arise solely because a manufacturer like Via Systems sends a byproduct for recycling rather than just disposing of it. TSCA contains specific exemptions for byproducts, but the EPA has narrowly interpreted these exemptions to apply only if the recycler does not use a chemical reaction to recover substances from the byproduct. Recovery of metals like gold, tin, and copper that are in our byproducts is impossible without the use of a chemical reaction. We manufacture printed circuit boards like this one. We don't manufacture chemicals. The EPA requires us to know at a molecular level what the recyclers of our byproducts do with our byproducts. The recyclers' processes are outside of our control. They're often proprietary, and they can change day to day based on the market conditions that those recyclers see. The result is a regulatory policy that forces companies to report data based on incomplete information and assumptions, ultimately compromising the data quality. EPA's overreaching interpretation affects a lot more facilities and companies than those represented by the IPC. Manufacturers from many industries are burdened by reporting their byproducts as new chemicals at the point where they send them for recycling. Much of the data that we report about byproducts under TSCA is also required by the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act and the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. Under TSCA, the recyclers are required to report the new chemicals they manufacture from our byproducts. The EPA unnecessarily burdens industry with the reporting of vast and duplicative data for some unknown future uses. As a nation, we recognize reduce, reuse, and recycle as goals. The EPA undercuts those goals with regulatory policy that effectively discourages us from recycling. We encourage Congress to explicitly exempt all byproducts, including those that are sent for recycling. As I mentioned earlier, we manufacture printed circuit boards, not chemicals. The focus of TSCA, should remain on ensuring the safety of chemicals in commerce. EPA's authority to regulate articles like printed circuit boards should be limited to situations where regulating the chemicals themselves is not enough to protect human health and the environment. In conclusion, IPC supports cost-effective, science-based environmental regulation. As I've discussed, it's critical that Congress reform TSCA in a way that directs the EPA to focus and prioritize its regulation of chemicals. We believe that EPA's reporting requirements for byproducts sent for recycling are burdensome, unnecessary, and as I mentioned, they actually discourage recycling. Thank you again for this opportunity to appear before you. I'd be happy to answer any questions when the time is right.
Thank you, sir. Now, Chair recognizes Dr. Beth Bosley, President, Bourne Specialties, on behalf of the Society of Chemical Manufacturers and Affiliates. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tongo, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to testify once
Can you
again
just pull that microphone just a little bit closer to you?
There we go. I'm pleased to testify once again on behalf of the Society of Chemical Manufacturers and Affiliates regarding TSCA today on Sections 4 and Sections 8. Just a background on SOCMA, over 80% of our members are small businesses. For example, my business just hired its 8th employee. Even with that small staff, we're committed to responsibly manufacturing our products here in the United States. We produce unique chemicals via novel manufacturing techniques that are used in the electronics, aerospace, and nuclear energy sectors. SOCMA's members' unique niche in the chemical industry is known for its innovation, entrepreneurship, and customer focus. I'd like to begin by saying that SOCMA remains committed to strengthening TSCA and appreciates the subcommittee's work on this aspect. We should avoid approaches to TSCA reform that would treat the vast universe of TSCA chemicals like the far narrower universes of food additives, drugs, and pesticides. In particular, the sheer number of new chemicals that are submitted to EPA each year and the evolving market needs mean that use-by-use approvals make sense for drugs and pesticides will not work for industrial chemicals in general. A TSCA reform bill should be fundamentally risk-based, as you've heard from others witnesses at the table, and it should require EPA to look at a chemical's inherent hazards along with its exposures when making regulatory decisions. An improved Section 4 should be tiered, targeted, and risk-based. Generally stated, the real problem with TSCA has been the treatment of existing chemicals. Section 4 gives EPA authority to require testing of existing chemical substances and mixtures once certain criteria are met. In this section, that allows EPAs to obtain measured data on existing chemicals if currently available data and experience are insufficient to reasonably predict their effects. The major shortcoming in this section is actually procedural. EPA is required to go through a rulemaking process, which has contributed to delays in EPA getting the data that they need. For example, EPA has taken years to finalize a number of high production volume chemical test rules, even though the industry has strongly supported such test rules. Voluntary efforts and enforceable consent agreements have helped streamline the testing process, but this section of TSCA could be strengthened by considering authorization for EPA to issue orders, similar to the way it issues orders for new chemicals. Any orders for testing approaches should be tiered and targeted. That is, they should start off at a screening level and focus the testing where the risk is greatest. A screening level analysis may show that hazard is sufficiently low that additional test data will not be necessary. The same goes for scenarios where exposures are highly unlikely. We support the notion that EPA should have to abide by basic standards of scientific quality in specifying and accepting and screening and testing data. We also believe alternatives to animal testing should be supported where they are sufficiently validated. The second major shortcoming of Section 4 is the lack of any requirement that EPA act on a specific number or a percentage of existing chemicals by any particular time. Congress should remove obstacles to more comprehensive EPA evaluation of inventory chemicals by mandating EPA to review a minimum number of chemicals annually via a risk-based prioritization process. We believe EPA has the expertise to do this. There are very talented scientists and engineers at EPA. Unfortunately, they don't have the resources to do that at this time. Reforms to Section 8 could give EPA a better understanding of the exposure scenarios and enable it to prioritize it more efficiently. As mentioned above, testing of existing chemicals should be tiered, targeted, and risk-based. Improvements to TSCA Section 8 could help EPA determine whether an existing chemical warrants testing. One way Section 8 could be improved is by requiring an inventory reset to ensure that the inventory of existing chemicals is current. This effort will also pare down the initial number of chemicals to be evaluated. It's a concept we've supported for many years and believe it's a vital first step to a robust and efficient existing chemicals policy. Another significant problem with Section 8 is that it does not authorize EPA to collect use or exposure information from anyone downstream of manufacturers or processors. The result is that in many cases, manufacturers are forced to make educated guesses about the end-use markets and exposure scenarios surrounding the use of their products. SOCMA would like to see an expansion of this section to allow collection of information from non-consumer downstream entities. Finally, we urge you to amend Section 8E to authorize manufacturers, processors, and commercial downstream distributors and users to file reports with EPA regarding non-adverse findings about chemicals. Currently, there is no mechanism to report such non-adverse data. The result is that the public database on existing chemicals is unnecessarily limited and biased toward the bad news. With reasonable amendments, TSCA could provide an easier mechanism to submit such information. As I conclude, it's important to mention that the Lautenberg-Vitter Chemical Safety Act, introduced into the Senate last year, is a remarkable example of well-reasoned bipartisan TSCA legislation, and we endorse it as a vehicle for reform. The subcommittee should be able to leverage much of the work done there, including the work on Sections 4 and 8. Thanks for this opportunity. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. And before I go to Dr. Willett, we did have Vitter and the new co-sponsor, Udall, here for a hearing on this bill, and we applaud their work and look forward to building on that. So the chair now recognizes Dr. Catherine Willett, Director, Regulatory Toxicology, Risk Assessment, and Alternatives from the Humane Society of the United States of America. Welcome, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Shimkus and Ranking Member.
Pull that mic just a little bit closer, too, because we want everyone to hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Shimkus and Ranking Member Tonko, for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Humane Society of the United States, the Humane Society Legislative Fund, two members of the nation's largest animal protection organization. We strongly support animal protection and also public health and environmental safety for people and the animals that are in our environment. And we believe that the Environmental Protection Agency should have the tools necessary to appropriately regulate chemicals in the United States. I'm excited to be here to discuss the opportunities for 21st century science to impact Section 4 of the Toxic Substances Control Act. I've been a bench scientist for 20 years, and some of those years I was a practicing toxicologist. For the past 7 years, I've worked internationally on chemicals policy. As mentioned by Chairman Upton, the science that underpins chemical characterization has undergone a radical transformation in recent years, as outlined in a 2007 report by the National Research Council, and which has also been taken up by EPA in their recent strategic plans. The report's conclusion is that reduced reliance on whole animal testing leads to a more relevant and efficient toxicity testing paradigm, resulting in increased protection for humans and the environment. Rather than relying on a rote battery of animal tests, this new approach involves an iterative process of chemical characterization, toxicity testing, and dose-response extrapolation modeling informed by population-based data and human exposure information. This transformation is in response to challenges that EPA has experienced in obtaining data on the tens of thousands of chemicals to which people and the environment are potentially exposed, and in accommodating increasingly complex issues, for example, life stage susceptibility, the effect of mixtures, varying exposure scenarios, and cumulative risk. Any effective modification of TSCA must allow for and encourage adoption of these evolving strategies. By articulating this in any legislative proposal, Congress will also send a strong message that more effective chemical regulation is dependent on more effective and humane chemicals testing. To do this, we urge Congress to be mindful of the following considerations. As also mentioned by Chairman Upton, computational, cell, and tissue-based methods can now be used to prioritize chemicals or groups of chemicals that are of primary concern. These methods can also be used to satisfy information needs in some cases for some chemicals. Further development and application of these methods for use in risk assessment should be encouraged. Updated legislation should be flexible enough to allow the inclusion of new testing methods and strategies as they are developed. New legislation should provide EPA with significant commitment for creating the necessary infrastructure to do this. New legislation should also offer strong incentives for companies to fund, develop, and use new methods and testing strategies. And as non-animal alternative methods become available, the use of such methods should be required in place of animal tests. We foresee a time when the principle of animal testing is a last resort. Protecting human health and the environment is a critical goal of effective chemicals regulation. In order to achieve this goal, it's necessary for any new legislation to allow and support the continuing evolution of the science of chemical assessment. The Humane Society of the United States hopes that we will have the opportunity to work with you on any legislative language to reauthorize aspects or the entirety of TSCA. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Dr. Jennifer Sass, Senior Scientist, National Resources Defense Council. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Chairman Shimkus and Ranking Member.
Also, just pull that. There you go. And
closer, okay.
if you can point the microphone to where your mouth is.
Nobody ever complains about not hearing me. So I want.
Well, our transcribist was freaking out over there.
I
so
on record. Thank you for the invitation to be here and to testify on this very important issue. As Mr. Waxman stated in his opening comments, TSCA is a statute that has failed to protect the public, and that's certainly true of its provisions regarding testing and data collection, which we're here to discuss today. TSCA needlessly impedes the collection of such information with predictable results. In the wake of the recent spill in West Virginia, the impact of the information gaps in TSCA are more visible. The leaking of 4-methylcyclohexane methanol, or the MCHM, and other chemicals into the Elk River in West Virginia brought home, literally into people's homes, the disturbing reality that no useful information is available to the public or those who serve them. In fact, a Pew Health Group research fact sheet put out in 2010 found that roughly 3,000 chemicals used at over 1 million pounds annually in the U.S., these are the HPV or high production volume chemicals, may have no information regarding potential developmental or pediatric toxicity. Nonetheless, over 700 of them are used in consumer products. CDC biomonitoring has found over 200 synthetic chemicals in the blood and urine of Americans. TSCA provisions set an excessively high bar that has effectively prevented EPA from getting information. First, EPA must essentially prove that a chemical poses an unreasonable risk to health or the environment before it can require the needed testing that would show a potential risk. This is like requiring a doctor to prove that a patient has cancer before being able to order a biopsy. It's a catch-22 construction of EPA's testing authority that has greatly constrained the agency from getting data through testing in a timely manner. Second, to require testing of existing chemicals, EPA must complete a full formal rulemaking. Other programs, including the pesticide program and even TSCA's new chemical program, instead allow EPA to require testing by issuing an order, which is a much more streamlined process. As a result of these substantive hurdles and procedural hurdles, in the nearly 40 years since TSCA's enactment, EPA has required a full set of testing data on only a few hundred of the 62,000 grandfathered chemicals that came in under the law in 1976. The good news is that the flaws in Section 4 of TSCA can be resolved relatively easily by eliminating the Catch-22 provisions of Section 4 and allowing the agency to require testing by order rather than by rule. The bottleneck would largely be eliminated, and the agency would begin to get more information in a timely manner necessary to inform and protect the public. The failure of TSCA and the subsequent action at the state level to collect information and to limit the use of harmful chemicals has prompted renewed discussion of TSCA reform, which is useful. But the Chemical Safety Improvement Act, S1009, as introduced, will not solve the problems with current TSCA, and in some respects will make things worse. The introduced bill would prevent EPA from requiring testing for a chemical until it has already been identified as a high-priority substance. This essentially replicates the existing Catch-22. EPA would generally need evidence of hazard or exposure for a chemical to be designated high priority in the first place. Although EPA would be allowed to require testing for high-priority chemicals by order, the universe of potential chemicals for which EPA could require testing would likely be greatly reduced. We also need more detailed use and exposure information for chemicals, as has been mentioned by other speakers, beyond what is currently captured in EPA's chemical data reporting rule. Unfortunately, the chemical industry has routinely failed to provide updated production, use, and exposure data and strenuously resisted government action to collect it. Various proposals have been made to reset the TSCA inventory as part of TSCA reform. If this is undertaken, Congress should not in any way delay efforts currently underway to take expedited action on substances such as chemicals that are PBTs, the persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic ones, or other chemicals for which we already have sufficient information to know that they are unsafe. Or slow, for example, EPA's current efforts to review its work plan chemicals. Second, if a substance is taken off the TSCA inventory, it should not be able to re-enter the inventory without going through a review process. A disturbing example is the Firemaster 550, which ended up back in products and in blood and breast milk. It is possible to have a balanced information regime that would protect the public while helping industry by increasing public confidence in its products. The committee can play a critical role in this, and we're happy to work on that, but we're not there now. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jerry Paulson, who is the chairperson of the Council on Environmental Health, Department of Federal Affairs, American Academy of Pediatrics. Sir, you're welcome, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Shimkus and Ranking Member Tonko and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today about the testing and data collection requirements under the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976. I'm Dr. Jerome Paulson, and I'm here representing the American Academy of Pediatrics, a nonprofit professional organization of 60,000 pediatricians dedicated to the health, safety, and well-being of infants, children, and adolescents. As mentioned, I currently serve as the chair of the AAP's Council on Environmental Health. I will summarize my written statement, a full copy of which I have submitted for the record. Chemical management reform is an important policy that uniquely impacts children's health. Children are not little adults. They have unique physiologic, behavioral, and developmental differences that amplify their exposure to chemicals in the environment. For example, infants may be exposed to contaminants in water used in formula preparation. Nobody else drinks formula. Toddlers engage in normal mouthing behaviors where they put objects into their mouths that may expose them to dangerous toxins. Children spend more time on the floor or the ground and come into more contact with contaminants on those surfaces. If we had kids in the hearing room today, they wouldn't be sitting on chairs. U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention researchers have found measurable levels of over 200 common industrial chemicals in body tissues and fluids of children of all ages, including cord blood. A number of hazardous chemicals also appear in breast milk. A substantial proportion, as Mr. Tomko mentioned, of chemicals known to have adverse and mostly irreversible effects on child health, such as lowering IQ, negative behavioral effects, and low birth weight and reduced head circumference. The safety testing requirements under Section 4 of TSCA are inadequate to protect children's health and place too great a burden for safety testing on the public sector. Chemicals introduced into commerce when the law was enacted are subjected to scant oversight. For new chemicals, the process basically doesn't work. And unless this legislation is reformed, with the tens of thousands of chemicals in need of review and the multi-year process for each undertaking, it would require many decades just to review high production volume chemicals. These flaws limit EPA's ability to protect the most vulnerable, including children and pregnant women, because the agency faces substantial barriers to obtaining the information needed to make effective risk management decisions. Under Section 8, TSCA has created a non-evidence-based system for chemical management. Concerns about chemicals are permitted to be kept from the public. In their notifications to EPA, chemical companies may declare large amounts of information to be confidential business information. This broad exemption has effectively prevented the Environmental Protection Agency from sharing information about potential hazardous chemicals with community groups, local and state governments, and other organizations. Certainly, an effective management system must include greater transparency than currently exists. Given the current urgent, ongoing threat to children posed by chemical exposures, the American Academy of Pediatrics respectfully submits the following key recommendations for reforming the Toxic Substances Control Act. Under Section 4, manufacturers should be required to provide minimum data sets with information that is relevant to the special needs of pregnant women and children regarding reproductive, developmental, neurodevelopmental toxicity, and endocrine disruption. Furthermore, EPA needs the flexibility to change data collection processes as new methodologies for testing become available. Under Section 4, the EPA should have a simple process to require additional testing when information suggests the need, especially for chemicals associated with child populations. The CDC's biomonitoring program must be expanded to serve as an early warning system for exposures. Aggregate and cumulative exposure concepts similar to those in the Food Quality Protection Act should be considered by EPA. Companies must develop public information documents for each new chemical marketed that utilizes lay language and is updated regularly. In conclusion, strong chemical management policy must integrate evidence-based decision-making for chemical use to adequately protect children and other vulnerable populations from harm. The American Academy of Pediatrics looks forward to working with you to advance sound and protective chemical management policy during the 113th Congress, and I'll be happy to entertain questions.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for the first round of, maybe the only round of opening questions. So my first one goes to Mr. Drevna. Section 8 contains regulatory exemptions as currently written. Some of these are for polymers and naturally occurring substances. Would you have concerns if a TSCA reform bill would invalidate those practices?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I believe that Section 8 needs some reform. But I think there's a major misconception about, what's out there and the 80,000 or so that some people say of chemicals that are out there, and really the 10,000 or so that are in commerce. So I think what EPA needs to do, what Congress should do, is direct EPA to say, okay, this is what's out there. And what's out there has to be, as many of the witnesses have said, has to, any regulation has to be tiered, targeted, and risk-based. I believe from hearing most of the witnesses here, if not all, that I think we all agree on it. I think it's what the definition of that is and what the ultimate goal of the modernization of TSCA should be. So I think if we can agree on what's out there, allow EPA to do a tiered, targeted, and risk-based approach, we can all get to the end goal here.
Thank you. Now, the panel we're not adversarial, so what I'd like to do is try to get answers quickly, and it's a big panel. So this is for everyone on the panel, but for everyone to get through, please be as concise as possible. Does it make sense to have information quality standards for EPA to make decisions about chemicals? Mr. Drevna?
It makes sense for EPA to have the authority to find out what's out there, and again, do a tiered, targeted, risk-based approach, and have the authority to do the testing.
Quickly.
One of the witnesses said get rid of Section 4, the risk assessment first, and we agree to that.
Mr. Matthews?
It's always hard to argue with the notion that we should have quality standards in what EPA does. So yes, we support EPA using best available science and modern techniques.
Mr. Grossman?
Yes, sir, we agree with you too.
Thank you. Dr. Bosley?
Yes, absolutely. Information quality is of utmost importance.
Dr. Willett?
Yes, yes, and EPA and other regulatory agencies have some of these, but they might be improved.
Dr. Sass?
I'm concerned about having them hardwired into the system. So while I think everybody agrees in principle, I think the process that the agencies are taking now to develop those in a public and transparent way with public comment is the approach that should be taken.
Dr. Paulson?
Quality standards are important, but I don't think they should be in the legislation. The EPA needs the flexibility to change with time, and as new methodologies for chemical testing come on the market, they need to be able to respond to that.
Well, and my next question follows along on that response. Should different standards apply to testing? Mr. Drevna?
Yes, it has to be what is the, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Matthews?
Yes.
Grasman?
I've got to defer. We're manufacturers, not chemicals.
Right, very good. Dr. Bosley?
Sure, it should be based on risk.
Dr. Willett?
I'm not sure I understand the question, I'm sorry.
Should there, chemicals and processes are not all the same. So the question is, should there be different standards apply, or should there be different standards to the level of risk-based chemical that might be out there?
Yes, I believe that's true, but I think I may tend to agree that it might not be a legislative issue.
Dr. Stess?
I think your question is about whether we should treat chemicals differently depending not only on their hazard but also on their exposure. And while I agree that there's an intelligence to that, the concern is that we have very little exposure information, so there's a practicality that's lacking.
Thank you. Dr. Paulson?
Mr. Shimkus, here again, I think the EPA needs to have some flexibility. For example, had we only used hazard information on the chemical that was spilled in West Virginia, which was an industrial chemical never intended for human exposure other than the workers, then that chemical would not be reviewed. So but in retrospect, we're obviously in a situation where we wish it had been. So the EPA needs some flexibility, and we know with the current law, the legislation has boxed them in such ways that they can't function. We should not repeat that.
Thank you. And just I'm going to take prerogative for a last question to Dr. Grasman. You raised in your opening statement this issue about how current TSCA law inhibits the ability to recycle. Many of us are very concerned about recycling. Mr. Green's concerned about electronic recycling. Recycling is a good thing, not a bad thing. How does current TSCA law hurt recycling aspects?
So if I took the byproducts from...
Pull the mic close.
If we chose to just landfill or get rid of the byproducts from our process, there's no TSCA obligation at all. When we choose to recycle, the TSCA obligations hit us in their full weight. So all things being equal, sometimes it's easier not to recycle.
Thank you. We had that issue on ink and oil a couple Congresses ago, and EPA kind of addressed it partially, but not full. So that's an issue that we've raised in this committee before. Thank you very much. Now I turn to the ranking member, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This subcommittee has heard at previous hearings that EPA's ability to require testing of new and existing chemicals under TSCA has been dangerously limited. TSCA requires any company planning to manufacture or import a new chemical substance to submit what's called a pre-manufacture notice. It is supposed to include information such as the chemical identity, use, anticipated production volume, exposure and release information, and existing available test data. According to EPA, 85% of the pre-manufacture notices that agencies receive are accompanied by no toxicity data whatsoever. Dr. Sass, what kind of concerns does this raise for you?
Well, the not having any information at all means that EPA doesn't know how to move forward. It means that EPA has very little power or ability to request that information. There's restraints and constraints put on EPA in order to move forward and collect that information. I think it burdens the agency unnecessarily. I think the burden should be placed on the industry to provide the information that EPA needs to do a risk assessment, but previous to that, do a proper hazard assessment.
Thank you. For existing chemicals, Section 4 of TSCA requires EPA to show that a chemical poses an unreasonable risk before requiring additional testing. Dr. Paulson, how has this requirement helped to undermine the law?
This requirement basically has created the non-evidence-based system that I referred to. An industry is basically penalized if they develop information in advance because then they're required to report it to EPA, and that may be adversely affect their bottom line. But with no reporting requirement and then no ability to request information because you don't know there might be a problem, EPA is totally stymied.
Thank you. With any reform, we must make sure EPA has adequate authority to require testing to protect human health and the environment. In the Senate, there is a proposal to require EPA to categorize each chemical as either high priority or low priority. Under that proposal, EPA would be blocked from requiring testing on low priority substances. My question, Dr. Sass, would be that would that proposal increase testing of the chemicals we are exposed to every day, or would it make the problem worse?
I think it would make the problem worse. It would hamstring EPA. It adds an additional catch-22 to EPA because it needs information to do a informed prioritization, and without that information, it may miss many chemicals that are very hazardous and may be very important not only for hazard but also for exposure. It would miss that information, and then it would not be allowed to go back and have the authority to review the low priority chemicals, and furthermore, at the state level, they may also be hampered. So those chemicals may actually slip through what's not just a hole in the net, but really is the whole net just doesn't exist because of those chemicals being able to fall through.
Okay, and Dr. Paulson, what does the Academy of Pediatrics think about blocking EPA from requiring testing on these so-called low priority chemicals?
Mr. Tonko, there does need to be a prioritization system for sure, but the EPA needs flexibility to move chemicals around, and any a priori blocking of chemical evaluation would imply that we would never learn anything. So if some miracle occurred and new information came, the EPA couldn't use that new information. So that just really makes no sense. We've waited 40 years to modify this law. We should not create more barriers with a new law that'll take another 40 years to improve.
Thank you. The recent West Virginia chemical spill has brought this debate to life in many ways. The chemical that spilled into the Elk River, called MCHM, was shrouded in mystery. State and federal officials had to scramble to uncover the few health and safety tests that had been conducted on that chemical. Dr. Sass, how did the lack of health and safety data on MCHM hinder the CDC and other officials when responding to that chemical spill?
The data for those chemicals didn't come out for some time, and that created a concern not only for public health officials at the state and local level to be able to advise the community and advise businesses about what to do, but also for the population as a whole, for citizens. The CDC was held back because it wasn't able to do the kinds of calculations and evaluations that it needs to provide informed and timely advice to the community. And also, health officials and first responders weren't able to get information rapidly. They were having to advise and treat under a situation where they were essentially blindfolded because of that situation.
Thank you. I see my time's exhausted, so I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes Chairman Emeritus Mr. Barton from the great Republic of Texas for 5 minutes.
If only we were still a republic, but, you know, that's water under the bridge. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. I don't have too many questions. My first question would be to Mr. Drevna, and you may not know the answer. Do you know how many chemicals right now are in the TSCA inventory?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Do you know how many chemicals right now are in the TSCA inventory? We talking hundreds of thousands, millions?
I would say somewhere 80 to 100,000, I would imagine, but if not more.
Okay. Anybody dispute that? Is that do you know how many new ones are listed each year, approximately?
I don't know, 700,000, not 700,000, 700 to 1,000, something like that.
Okay. Is there a, I know this whole hearing is on testing and disclosure, but is there a major controversy? I know we have the issue of the animal testing, but other than that, is there any major controversy on how these new chemicals are tested?
I think, I believe that the new testing, the testing for new chemicals is pretty well established. As much as I criticize EPA, they've done a nice job, in my understanding, doing the new chemicals.
Do any of our other witnesses at the end of the table dispute that? Two of them. Okay, let's go to the young lady. What's your dispute with what Mr. Drevna just said about that?
There's very little testing done on new chemicals, so EPA has issued some test rules, but it's been very few, in a very few number of chemicals. EPA is restrained in a number of ways from issuing those test rules. There's timing on those, there's authority limitations for EPA, there's the requirement that it needs to actually find some hazard before it can issue new test rules, that catch-22 that several witnesses, including myself, mentioned. So actually, it's been very ineffective. There's been very few chemicals that have been tested.
Now, is your complaint that EPA has tended to engage in what we call a voluntary procedure as opposed to the more complicated mandatory procedure? Is that a complaint, or?
Well, it's a complaint where it hasn't worked. So there have been a number of voluntary initiatives that have been larger, and there's been some information that has been gathered from those, but not very much. So I would say that they haven't been effective overall, and there's been congressional reviews that have shown that. But at the chemical by chemical level, so as chemicals are coming through the program, mostly instead of EPA issuing test rules, because they are very cumbersome and because they can be challenged, EPA tends to negotiate with the company about what test rules it'll issue. I'm not opposed to that, so I'm not complaining about that process, except where it has held back on EPA from being able to issue the kind of test rules that it needs to make a proper hazard evaluation.
Dr. Paulson, you raised your hand.
I think that the voluntary programs have been ineffective. They've produced very little in the way of new information. The current legislation and the judicial interpretation of that legislation effectively block the EPA's ability to ask companies for toxicologic information on the chemicals that they are introducing into the market. And that results in playing catch-up, where years later, individual scientists at universities do studies, and lo and behold, we find chemicals in human bodies that were never intended to be in human bodies, and we find that those chemicals have adverse effects on those human bodies There are just numerous examples of that.
Give me one example.
Brominated flame retardants, perfluorinated chemicals, of which Teflon is one brand name. Those are two examples.
And it's those chemicals were improperly tested or improperly used or illegally used?
None of the above, sir. They weren't adequately tested before they were marketed. They were used in ways that presumably industry thought was safe because they themselves did not have the data to indicate that they were getting into human bodies until later, and they didn't have the data that they were harming human bodies until later. So I'm not suggesting any malfeasance here. It's just that unless we develop the data before the chemicals come on the market, we are always subject to playing catch-up.
Okay, my time has expired, and I want to thank the panel.
I want to thank my colleague. I just want to follow up real quick on one of the answers. It's our understanding the burden of proof is in Section 4, not Section 5. So we got to be careful that we're conflating the authority under this law. That's why going through this legislative process and our hearing is going to be very difficult, because we found that this language is very, very tough. So with that, I'd like to yield to my colleague, Mr. Green from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your interest in e-waste, and hopefully we can have a legislative hearing sometime so we can...
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you. I'm sorry.
The frustration that all of us have is that I can't imagine how hard it was in 1976 for Congress to do TSCA, and that's probably why for the last 38 years it hasn't been revisited, because of the complexity of it. My first question is that before a company introduces something into a product, should there be some minimum level of due diligence? Because Dr. Polson, you talked about the companies don't know. Should there be some type of due diligence by that company just to make sure that both for the folks that are producing that product, but also for the consumers, that they should have that due diligence on the toxicity of that product?
Yes, sir. That should be the basic function of any chemicals management policy, and we don't have that now.
Okay. We heard testimony today about how difficult it is for EPA to make the required findings to require the generation of additional information on chemicals under existing provision Section 4. What additional authority should EPA have to mandate the testing? Like I said, maybe we ought to say there's a requirement by a company to do some basic due diligence, and then EPA should have the authority to ask for that information?
Companies should be required to release information to EPA. EPA should not have to ask for it. It should be part of the process before a chemical goes on the market. That information goes to EPA. EPA is then able to evaluate that information and make a decision. We also have to recognize that even under the best of all possible circumstances, chemicals will receive approval that later turn out to be problematic. So EPA needs a mechanism to require companies to do post-market surveillance, provide the information on post-market surveillance.
I understand that, but I also know that, and I've heard that, you know, on any given day or week, and at least in the last 38 years, how many different chemical substances have been entered into the market. Now, somewhere along the way, you know, if we have literally thousands of companies, and for them to give that information to EPA and then to empower EPA to then go forward, I agree that, you know, EPA should have the authority to request that information in those testing levels. But I'm just wondering, you know, how big EPA would have to be able to deal with the complexities of the market now. And I know from our manufacturers and our specialty companies, it's got to be huge numbers of chemicals that are developed literally almost every day. Can y'all just give us some idea on that?
Well, EPA looks at 20 chemicals a week, 20 new chemicals a week. That's their statistics. And beyond that, industry develops other chemicals that don't go forward, certainly. But the resources EPA needs to look at new chemicals are very different than what they've been given to look at existing chemicals. They have no mandate, really, to look at existing chemicals, and therefore that's not where the resources are spent.
Well, and that's part of our concern. I want to make sure, you know, we have our lifestyle has been built over the use of these chemicals. And granted, there are times, for example, in West Virginia that nobody knew about that chemical. Even the first responders didn't know how to deal with it. So we need to deal with those, but we also need to, and that's the job of our subcommittee, to come up with something that will do that.
Mr. Green, you're right. The thing about Section 4, in which we agree to an extent that the finding requirement should be eliminated, but the hazard requirement should stay. So, I mean, you could in essence limit the number of chemicals that have to be looked at if you grant EPA the authority for testing, but they have to still have a component of that says, wait a minute, there's a need out there and for an exposure and a hazard requirement. So that would go a long way to remedying the situation. And I mean, there have been criticisms of EPA because, or criticisms of TSCA because it inhibits EPA from collecting information. But there are other statutes that come into play too, Administrative Procedures Act, things like that. So look at it holistically also. And you're right, though, Mr. Green. We've got so many, you know, large volume chemicals that never see your intermediates that never really see the market.
Yeah. Well, and that's, and Chairman, I know I'm almost out of time, but but also the low priority and high priority, obviously something that's exposed to vulnerable populations should be a higher priority even, you know, and so there's a way I think we can draft this, but it's not going to be easy any more than it was in 1976. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate this panel. We're learning a lot from all of you here. Mr. Drevna and Mr. Matthews, I think Dr. Grassman, you may have talked about this too, about this whole prioritization process, how it works. And I believe, Mr. Drevna, in your testimony, you wrote that there was not 80,000 chemicals. Am I correct? That was in yours, and there really only about 10,000. How do we prioritize the safety of these in making some determinations? How do we set these rules up? My concern, all of our concern, is that which is not forbidden is permitted, or that which is permitted is not forbidden, and we want to make sure we do this right. How would you recommend wording of this work?
Well, I'll go back to what I said earlier, Congressman Murphy: tiered, targeted, and risk-based. If you give EPA the authority through statute to use that kind of mentality when addressing whatever chemical it is, whether it's a high-volume chemical or whether it's something that's a daily household product. If you do a tiered, targeted, and risk-based, and understand what the hazards are, what the toxicity is, what the exposure is, and that will go a long way to giving EPA the right tools to address the situation.
Okay, Mr. Matthews, you have anything to add?
Well, I appreciate the doctor.
Oh, we have honorary doctors.
Well, we agree, but let's be clear. The impression shouldn't be formed that there isn't substantial information on a lot of these chemicals that are in commerce, including existing chemicals, not just new chemicals. EPA has substantial information. It allows it to start to make some judgments about which are the chemicals that should be first put through a screening process, part of prioritization. What we've said is they have substantial information, but they're missing a key component, and that is the use and exposure-related information. So we think that EPA can do a proper screening process, even of the tens of thousands of chemicals that are already out in the marketplace. They need to do that. Make no mistake, this can't be done overnight. The numbers we're talking about are substantial. But in order to get to the right choices first, they need not only the information they've historically been receiving, but additional use and exposure information, and start the process of getting through these existing chemicals that have been on the market.
Thank you. And Dr. Bosley, could you explain the importance of how you protect the chemical identity of information that's submitted to EPA as part of TSCA?
Certainly. So we in the chemical industry are first and foremost not one of us wants our chemical to cause harm to human health or the environment. By the same token, we live in the market reality and we are faced with competitors every day. And if, for instance, my company, very, very small, my competitors all know who I am. If I were to submit something to EPA with the chemical identity revealed, they would know immediately what sort of research I was doing, and because my markets are so limited, they would know exactly where that end market would be. So it's not that I want to hide any hazard information that I have. I don't. I want to send that all out. But I would like to keep my chemical ID confidential as long as there's a robust generic name such that the public, that NGOs, and that EPA can all see what the generic name and what the hazard is.
Thank you. Dr. Sass, I believe you, if I'm correct, recommending we adopt some of the standards the REACH program has in Europe. You think that would be more effective for us to do that?
That wasn't in my testimony. Is that your question?
No, that's my question. Do you think that would be
Do I think it would be more effective? Well, I do think it would be more effective to have harmonization, and the other speakers have also mentioned that. I mean, having a patchwork approach across continents, across countries, across states isn't any good for anybody. And I do think that the approach we should use should be the highest bar to protect human health and the environment. I think that's not only saves costs for and liabilities for the producers, manufacturers, users, and retailers, but also insurers and the healthcare. So, I mean, the difference between having a cancer and treating it and never having had the cancer in the first place is huge, not only on personal costs, but on economic costs. So I think everybody has an interest in preventing problems. I think everybody agrees to that. The difference is how we're going to address them and at what stage we're going to address them. So I would support a system that would give the regulatory agencies the authorities not only to have early, comprehensive, and timely testing, but to make decisions on what they have. Some of the other speakers have mentioned, and I agree, that we have substantial data on a number of chemicals, and I think we can take action on those.
I know we're almost out of time, but Dr. Bosley, I'd like you to submit also your responses to that in terms of how the REACH requirements would contribute to being a big trade barrier for the United States. I'm going to also add this too. I was recently meeting with a company in my district, Calgon Carbon. This little bottle of granulated activated carbon is what's used in many cases to clean up some of these chemical aspects. 1 gram of this, and there's about 5 grams in a pack of sugar, has more surface area than a football field. And I would hope that as we're looking at these TSCA issues too, that we include in the whole package of analysis here not only what are the toxic levels in some of these chemicals, but also the cleanup process that would mitigate these things is a critically important part, which we could take a chemical of concern to a chemical of safety. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A number of today's witnesses have testified in support of a risk-based approach to chemical regulation, and I'd like to explore this topic. Dr. Sass, I'd like to see if you can help us understand what a risk-based approach means. To understand the risk a chemical poses, EPA would have to need information on both the hazard the chemical presents as well as information about exposure. Can you tell us what information EPA would need to implement a risk-based system that the American people can have faith in?
Well, sure. So EPA already does conduct risk assessments on chemicals, and that means that it has both how bad the chemical is, the hazard information, and what are the chances or probabilities that you're going to be exposed to it, the exposure information, and that's important. But earlier than that, EPA has to be able to collect both those sets of information, and what this is trying to get at is hazard. It's important to separate those out because later when you make risk management decisions, they will take into account exposure as well. But at this stage, doing a hazard assessment, it's critical to focus on the hazard only. There's a number of reasons why. For one thing, we have more of that data than we do about exposure information. Exposure information is very, very expensive and difficult to get. I wish that the chemical industry could give us the kind of exposure information that they've all testified that EPA should have.
Well, without this information, we wouldn't be able to understand the risk a chemical presents. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. Half the equation would be gone. We don't have that information.
And Dr. Paulson, do you agree?
Yes, Mr. Waxman.
I'd like to turn to Mr. Drevna. In your testimony, you suggested EPA should first make screening decisions. That is, EPA should determine whether a chemical should be a high priority or a low priority based on existing information about what you describe as, quote, potential hazards and exposures, end quote. Are you recommending that EPA make decisions without having actual information about hazards and exposures?
No, sir, not at all. What we're recommending
Is your mic on there?
Yeah, it was.
Okay. Yeah.
No, sir, not at all. We're recommending that, you can adopt a system like Canada's, like the Canadians have adopted, where you can have, you rank chemicals, you understand the molecular structure to most of them, you can extrapolate, you can use current technologies to figure out, rank them, do the exposure studies. We're recommending that EPA have the authority to ask for exposures, under a new Section 8A, and as you see my testimony. So, but no, absolutely not. We're recommending that.
I appreciate that. So under the Senate proposal, the screening level decision would be a very important one, because once a chemical is designated as a low priority, the chemical is shielded from further study and review. Dr. Sass and Dr. Paulson, is there sufficient existing information in most cases for EPA to determine that chemicals are low priority and shouldn't be subject to any further scrutiny?
No, that concerns me. Determining something is a low priority or not hazard should be a very high bar. For example, the International Agency for Research on Cancer under the World Health Organization has, I think, only 1 or 2 chemicals in that category. It should be a very high bar to actually put something aside and not look at it anymore from a public health and environmental protection perspective.
Is there sufficient information?
Without sufficient information.
Dr. Paulson?
No, sir. I think particularly for new chemicals, by definition, there's not sufficient exposure information. And even for chemicals that have been around for a number of years, there may not be biomonitoring methodologies that are available. There may not be methodologies for measuring those chemicals in soil or other organisms besides humans. So as Dr. Sass mentioned, exposure information exposure information is often extremely limited.
Okay, well, in Mr. Grasman's testimony, he objects to EPA collecting certain information. For example, he objects to the collection of information about worker exposure. He also seems to object to reporting about the volume of each chemical that is manufactured and the consumer and commercial uses of chemicals. Dr. Sass, this seems like important information for understanding exposure. Can EPA evaluate exposure and therefore risk if it doesn't have information on how chemicals are used and how exposure might occur?
No, Mr. Waxman, you're exactly right. EPA needs much more use and production and also downstream use information. It needs to be able to update that information in a timely manner as that chemical travels through commerce and has different applications.
So we would be fooling ourselves. If we want EPA to make good decisions, then that means we don't want them guessing. That means you can't have both a risk-based system and an unwillingness to provide EPA with adequate information. Is that your
That's
view?
correct, I agree.
And Dr. Paulson, would you care to comment on this issue from a children's health perspective?
While adult workers obviously aren't children, they are often sentinels, and we need to be able to gather information on worker exposure and use that information to help understand perhaps either gaps that we need to fill about children or be able to extrapolate to children in the instances where you can. So just in that one narrow area that you're talking about, I certainly agree that that blocking the EPA's ability to collect and use that data will make it much more difficult to make decisions about chemicals.
Thank
Gentlemen.
you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, gentlemen, it's time expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
All our witnesses for being with us today. Greatly appreciate it. There we go. Mr. Drevna, if I could again start with you. Do you believe that how do you believe the coordination has been between the EPA and the TSCA interagency testing committee has been?
That's a good question. I mean, I really, I really don't know what they've done. I don't.
Have you heard anybody else talking about it, or just no one? Okay, well, maybe we ought to check into that. Mr. Matthews, if I could ask you, currently TSCA includes processors within the scope of Section 8, and in your testimony you discuss how a revised TSCA should expressly allow the EPA to collect necessary use information from downstream processors. How does this improve upon the existing construct? And then just as a follow-up then, do all processors support the view?
Do all processors
support this view?
Well, okay. I mean, I'm here to speak on behalf of CSPA. I was at pains to say we are a segment of that industry. One of the problems EPA has is they've had difficulty defining who a processor is. We circulated a 190-page document they created that attempted to define processor, but in the end it couldn't. So it is a very broad category. And coming back to your first question, one of the problems, I think, is that EPA literally fears sending out an information request or demand from, quote, processors, because it will produce more information than they can conceivably manage. What we have proposed is a more targeted and focused information flow of use and exposure information from that segment of the processor community that we represent, which is household and institutional products, which during that screening phase, during the prioritization phase, will actually align with the kinds of issues that EPA is considering. Where it does have, and I would go back to the questions that have been asked about hazard, you still need hazard information, and there is substantial information on hazard that's already been generated, and EPA has its authorities in that regard. But you would combine that with the kind of information about exposures that EPA is concerned about, as it says, how do we work through tens of thousands of chemicals in a logical way, which should be our priorities, and on that basis, the kind of information that we would provide, I think, would go a long way to answering those questions.
Thank you. Dr. Grossman, what is the EPA doing with all of this duplicative byproduct data that they're collecting?
It's a good question, sir, and I don't know the answer. We've seen no evidence that they're doing anything. And part of this, and it actually goes back to the comment Mr. Waxman made quoting my written testimony. As I mentioned, we're a manufacturer. We make our products through a series of chemical and physical steps. None of the chemical steps is perfectly balanced. Each one produces a byproduct. And so right now, when I say we find it very difficult to report to EPA the amount and nature of each byproduct, it's because I've got 30 chemical processes that might use 5 different chemicals that we buy, and then I have to understand the amount of each component that's left over, how they may react, and how any recyclers I send it to may process it. So if you imagine that EPA is not only trying to handle the data from chemical manufacturers, but from people like us, it truly would be overwhelming.
Let me follow up. Even if these byproduct manufacturers were to be exempted from reporting, companies manufacturing new chemicals from recycled byproducts would still be required to report on the manufacturing they were manufacturing. Is that what would be happening then? That they?
Yes, sir. The processors of our byproducts are reporting on what they make out of them.
Okay. If I could, Mr. Drevin, if I could go back to you, I was kind of interested in what you were saying about Canada and about the model that they use up there. How would you rate the model that they use in Canada?
Well, I think it's, Congressman, I think is one we should, the Congress should either require or help EPA adopt. I think it's a good program. It's as one of the witnesses says, it will help. It would help, categorize. It would help eliminate, and it's working for our friends to the north.
Okay, and I know that Mr. Murphy had asked a question a little bit earlier about this, or kind of touched on it. Also, in your testimony, I found it interesting that many people have the false impression that there are 80,000 chemicals in commerce, and you say it's something less than 10,000. How did we ever come up, or where did it ever come up that people thought there were 80,000? Well, I think once a chemical is out there on a list, it never gets off, and there are so many intermediates. It's like the Hotel California. You can come in, but you can't check out. Okay. On that Eagles note, I'll yield back.
Showing your age. So thank you. Now the chair recognizes the gentlelady from the Denver Broncos, from the great state of Colorado, Ms. DeGette, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And in an attempt to be bipartisan, I'll say we're working together very well on this TSCA reauthorization, and I'm pleased that we're having this hearing. There's a group of us on this side of the aisle who really do want to work in developing this legislation, as we discussed last night, and I'm hoping we can do it as it goes along. I think there's consensus that some of the biggest problems we have with the implementation of TSCA are rooted in the procedural requirements under Section 4 for testing existing chemicals. And so I want to focus on that during the first part of my questioning. Dr. Bosley, I wanted to ask you, yes or no, should the EPA have to go through a rulemaking every time it needs data on an existing chemical?
No, absolutely not.
And Dr. Sass, what's your view on that?
No, it should not. I agree.
Okay. And so it seems to me, I think everybody pretty much agrees on this, one of the easiest ways to improve TSCA would be to allow the EPA to request testing by order than rulemaking, especially for existing chemicals where the data probably already exists. Everybody is nodding, so Mr. Matthews, I'm going to pick on you for a second. I know you've got extensive experience providing counsel to chemical companies, and I'm assuming that chemical companies, legitimate ones like your clients, perform basic testing of the products they sell in order to determine they're safe. Is that right?
Well, mind you, we are the downstream purchasers of raw
Okay.
materials from upstream. It's upstream where that actual testing of the chemical itself takes place, but our companies go to great lengths to ensure that the chemicals they put into their products are safe. So
Right.
they are looking at that data.
So both the manufacturers, but your clients too, they're not going to put those things on the market unless they're pretty sure they're safe.
That would be absolutely correct.
And so both the downstream and upstream folks are going to have information on file about the effects of the products, right?
Our view has been, I think often the manufacturers say it's not readily ascertainable to us as to how it's being used and what kind of exposures are being created. So they have some, but not enough for EPA's purposes. That's where we come in.
Okay. And so what you said in your written testimony is exactly that. Very little information is readily available to the agency on how chemicals are used in U.S. commerce in order to fully inform prioritization and to assess the human health and environmental risks. That's exactly the point. So I guess I'd like it if you could just spend a second talking to me about what you think about the current process of rulemaking and what could be done to help the EPA access this information better. Would your clients agree with a different system? And what would it be?
Indeed, we would. We've proposed that there actually be statutory changes that would address a more direct and meaningful role of the downstream community that has.
But what would those statutory, we're drafting the bill, so what kinds of changes would you support?
We would support the statute directing EPA in the process of, when it goes through this screening process. We're trying to thread the needle here. They have to screen to get to prioritization, to get to a list of substances that will go through a safety assessment process. So as they conduct that initial screening, they have substantial information at their disposal. And we're talking existing.
So you would support them providing that information to the EPA?
I think EPA generally has a lot of that information, but yes, any updated information should be
without
provided
rulemaking
from the manufacturers.
Right.
And now we would propose adding to that provisions that would direct the agency to also then collect for the substances under review use and exposure information from the companies that have it.
Great, thank you. Now, Dr. Paulson, I want to talk for a minute about the EPA authority, because they've got 83 existing chemicals right now, so that's good. But as the EPA studies those priority chemicals, science will evolve, and we might know more about those chemicals that are not on the priority list. So, Dr. Paulson, you support a simpler process for the EPA to gather data. Can you just talk briefly about how our understanding has evolved of how chemicals affect infants, children, and other vulnerable populations.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Children have periods of vulnerability from the time that really actually start before conception, if we can understand that, conceptualize that, and then after conception, throughout pregnancy, and the brain finally finishes developing somewhere around 25 years of age in terms of final myelinization of coating of the nerve cells in the frontal part of the brain. Likewise, the lungs continue to develop until children reach whatever their adult height is. So this is a process that takes many, many years, and damage that is done before the process has finished, whether you're talking about the lungs or the brain or the kidney, often is irremediable. You don't get to start over or do over in the human body. So data that is collected to make decisions on the safety of chemicals needs to acknowledge these periods of vulnerability, test around issues that pertain to these periods of vulnerability, and then use that information in decision making.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time's expired. I do look forward to working with her. And if you check on 8D, I'm not going to read this part, but part of that is in current law too, and that's part of the problem of some of the things that you asked about. Chair now recognizes gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Several of the panelists and some of the members of Congress have mentioned, drawn attention back to the problem they had down in the 2nd District in West Virginia, down in the southern part of the state. I join with you in the disgust and the fury internally I have over the breakdown of why that could occur. So I'm hoping that from this hearing and elsewhere we'll learn more and not do a knee-jerk reaction, but we'll try to get this thing resolved. I know the Attorney General is looking into it, and a series of others are looking at that. But let me go back to Dr. Paulson, some of your remarks. In your testimony, you said that under TSCA Section 8, companies are required to keep a file of allegations of significant adverse reactions to human health or the environment of any chemical they manufacture. And the companies must also provide this information to the EPA upon request. Now, I'm just curious, given the MCHM issue of being discharged into the Elk River, do any of you know, was there a request that was denied about the MCHM?
I'm sorry, can you state the last part of that question again? Just didn't quite hear you.
Did the EPA, did they seek information about this? Because that's what it says. Companies must provide this information to the EPA upon request. Did the EPA request information about this chemical, one of 2 chemicals that was discharged into the Elk River?
In the post-leak time phase, I don't know, sir.
Okay. Because I'd like to, well, let's build just a little bit further with that. Is there something more that they can do? Because I heard a little bit, you were saying, I think in your testimony about these things that deal with confidentiality. I'm just wondering whether or not that was also an item. Was it held back because of confidentiality? Or Dr. Sass, do you know whether or not either of these things have occurred?
So I do not know the specifics of conversations that may have happened early in the spill between EPA and West Virginia, but I think what the speakers had talked about, if I'm correct, referring to your question, is the idea that if there's an accident or a spill or an incident like this, that it should be reported to EPA. And the model, I think, is FIFRA 6A2, which is the pesticide model, so that if there's an incident or a spill or a poisoning, that a report has to be made to EPA under FIFRA 6A2, and that data is kept there, and that the obligation to make that is the registrant, the chemical manufacturer in this case. And that way EPA has a docket of these. And so later, when EPA is reviewing those pesticides, which it does every 15 years on a routine basis and updates the science, it can look and see if there's been a problem with fish kills, with worker poisonings, child poisonings, things like that.
I'm just trying to figure how we can strengthen it, how we can make this thing work better. Because was this information even available? That's what I'm trying to find out about the MCHM. Was it out there? And
we
because
do know
first responders needed to know, there was a delay in reporting. We've got to find out how to make this thing better. And so I'm looking under Section 8 how we might be able to modify that.
Well, we do know that the company Eastman did provide some additional information, and I don't know whether that was at the request of EPA, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry,
Okay,
the West Virginia Department of Health. So they did, in relatively short order, provide some additional information. Then the federal agencies needed to analyze that, which of course takes time. I think that had this information been provided to the government before the spill, there might have been a quicker turnaround.
Well, that's where I'm trying to find out is why why it failed under Section 8, that they didn't provide that information prior to this. That's what I'm trying to find out about. But let me just close in the few seconds we have left. That I join with you in this concern about what happened down there and the need to work on TSCA. I'm with you on that as one of just 2 engineers here in Congress. We need to work on this. But I'm also, I wish I could have seen the same fury that you all about the situation in Budd, West Virginia. Budd, West Virginia, for those of you who aren't aware, they've been without water this is their 6th month. It's for a community. Dr. Willett, you're in a concern with the humane, with the animal. Where are they getting their water? Because it's untreated. And these people are, for 6 months, have gone without water down in the Wyoming County, West Virginia. 6 months. And I haven't seen anything in the headlines about that. You know, people chasing that issue to take care of those families, the children looking for water, and their fountains in their school districts are closed. I know this, we don't have jurisdiction over that, but I would think many of the advocates out there in America would have raised this issue that that's not an acceptable way for a community to exist, to have to rely for 6 months on bottled water. Afraid my time's over.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Mr. Chair.
Would the gentleman yield?
Mr. Chair, if I might, I think that that line of questioning from our colleague is important because it highlights one of the failures of the existing law in that it didn't require the company to notify EPA of the substance. So vast improvements are required here.
I thank my colleague. I would just remind my colleagues that there is federal law called the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, in which they should have filed with the local first responders. The second thing is under Section 8E is parallel authority, and so is 8C, that this information should have been filed with the EPA. So having that, I'll turn to Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I just want to say all the testimony I've heard this morning was very constructive, very positive in terms of where we should be going, and I appreciate that. Dr. Paulson, in your testimony, you raised concern about chemical companies claiming that important health and safety data is confidential business information. Have CBI claims made it difficult for key stakeholders to gain information about potentially hazardous chemicals?
To the extent that we don't know what's included in the CBI claims, I can't answer that definitively, but certainly that's a big concern. I think there is information that should be available to the public that these companies know, and they're making claims of CBI that block the public's right to know.
Well, today the committee received a letter from the Center for Environmental Health regarding today's hearings on Sections 4 and 8 of TSCA. Mr. Chairman, I request this letter be made a part of the hearing.
Without objection, so ordered. I think we've already seen it.
Thank you. According to the letter, the Center for Environmental Health, and I quote, is particularly concerned with whether or not the EPA has enough data to make appropriate designation for individual chemicals. Any revision of TSCA must ensure that the EPA has adequate data to demonstrate that the chemical truly has a reasonable certainty of no harm before the agency deems the chemical to be a low priority. Then they go on to note that the law must require chemical companies to submit minimum information sets in a timely manner, equipping the EPA to evaluate new chemicals and new uses of chemicals and to evaluate chemicals for prioritization. Mr. Paulson, what's your biggest concern about what TSCA might not do, revision of TSCA, what the revision of TSCA might not do?
My biggest concern is that a revision to the Toxic Substances Control Act would not allow EPA to collect sufficient data to make decisions. And they can't make good decisions without good data. There need to be identified minimum data sets that will collect information that pertains to children and pregnant women, at least from my standpoint as a pediatrician. They're not the only groups that need protection, but let me just talk as a pediatrician. And that unless any new legislation gives them that authority, gives them the authority to request additional information when they feel that it's necessary, and gives them the authority to continue to receive information after a marketing decision has been made, then we'll all be right back here talking about problems with chemical management policy.
Thank you. Dr. Sess, do you have additional concerns about what the new legislation may not accomplish?
I think that my biggest concern is actually that it won't give EPA the authority to actually make a decision, to take action, that it will hold EPA in a holding pattern forever, collecting information and needing more information and waiting for information, not being able to. And that would be sad because there's huge initiatives across all agencies to develop more rapid and less costly testing. And I think that Dr. Willett had mentioned some of these. We can start to do mixtures, we can do formulations, we can look at interactions, different life stages. There's some exciting new scientific data on the horizon, the near and the far horizon. Computational toxicology will be really exciting, and it would be a shame if EPA was hamstrung in an old dinosaur science framework.
Thanks, Mr. Drevna. What's your biggest concern about what the new legislation may do?
Two things, Congressman. One, we have to keep in mind that this is a health and an environment statute, and it is a commerce statute. And one of the things of a major concern to us is federal preemption. We would urge Congress in its revisit and rewrite of TSCA to make sure that as I said, that we don't inhibit the manufacturing renaissance by having a patchwork quilt of kinds of various state regulations. I think this is a statute that calls for federal preemption.
Anyone else on the panel wish to answer that question? What's your biggest concern about what the legislation may do? All right, with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnston, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank the panel for being with us today. Let me start with Dr. Willett and Dr. Bosley, if I could. How do you respond to the call for a minimum data set on all chemicals on the TSCA inventory, and why? Dr. Willett, you go first.
I believe that our science and technology is at the point where we can redefine what minimum data set means.
Okay. Dr. Bosley?
I think that the general industrial chemicals are not a one-size-fits-all, and I think a minimum data set is the wrong approach. I think that the data sets that EPA needs should be based on the risk of the chemical.
Okay. For both of you, a follow-on, is every data gap a data need, in your opinion, and why?
That's a tough question. No.
Okay.
I think EPA should be allowed to figure out which data gap is really a data need. They're, as I said, very talented scientists and engineers there, and they know what data they need.
Okay. Dr. Willett, a follow-on for you. You mentioned that a single two-generation reproductive toxicity study requires at least $380,000, 2 years, and 2,600 rats. Is this kind of test normal under a minimum data requirement?
It depends on the chemical sector, but it is a common test that's required now.
So it would be considered normal? Okay. Mr. Grossman, how are you today?
Good, thank you, sir.
How are things back in North Jackson?
North Jackson is doing well.
Good, good. Mr. Grossman, Section 9 of TSCA directs the EPA to coordinate TSCA actions with actions taken under other federal laws to avoid unnecessary duplication. As a manufacturer, are you aware of any steps that EPA has taken to coordinate reporting requirements
No, sir,
or processes?
we're not aware of any.
You're not aware of any coordination that they've done?
We report, and for understandably good reasons, to multiple divisions of government and organs of government that ask for the data.
Okay.
Whether it's the first responders in our area, whether it's the environmental, plus as a business, it's everybody from our insurers and our own shareholders and our own systems. So
Same data?
Pardon?
Same data?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you describe for the subcommittee the environmental reporting that your company undertakes under other laws? Now, you just mentioned a few of them, and how that may overlap with the reporting requirements under Section 8 of TSCA?
To do a complete job, I'd really rather follow up with you later and
okay.
that information.
If you could get us that would be great.
Yes, sir. Happy to.
What steps does your company take to ensure the responsible use, storage, and transfer of chemicals? What laws, for example, regulate these activities?
Every material that we bring in our factory is evaluated for its safety in terms of its storage, its handling to our workers, and its possible interactions with the other chemicals that we use. Everybody from our insurance company to the third-party registrar of our environmental management system audits our facilities against both the chemical and the handling aspects of those things. We have customers doing audits because when a Department of Defense program is buying their circuit boards from us, if our factory fails, potentially they fail. So they're in making sure that our processes are safe and will provide a continued stream of products that they need.
Okay.
And then we've actually instituted a program called layer process audits, where literally every day, every part of the factory is being looked at against checklists for safety and efficiency.
Are there any regulatory gaps that we should worry about closing?
I think the aspect of the regulation that surprised us when we chose to start recycling, that we got hit as if we were manufacturing chemicals. I would like to see that closed, and I think that would also help EPA in reducing the data they need so that they can focus on those that are necessary for their effectiveness.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes my colleague from the state of Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our panel. I really apologize. I was at another hearing and couldn't come and hear your testimony, but I do have a few questions. As written, Section 4 of TSCA makes it extremely difficult for the EPA to require testing of existing chemicals, but that doesn't mean, as has been discussed, the chemical companies never conduct any tests on these chemicals. You may conduct safety testing for a variety of reasons, apart from any requirement on TSCA. A company could conduct safety tests to comply with the state law, to meet European requirements if you want to export, or a company may want to conduct testing to assess potential tort liabilities. So, Dr. Bosley, is that right, that companies may conduct safety tests on a chemical for a variety of reasons?
Yeah, we conduct tests whether or not EPA asks for them in general.
And Mr. Matthews?
Yes, companies are not doing the actual toxicity testing, but they don't put a product in the market where they haven't reviewed the toxicity of each of the chemicals they put in those products.
But the EPA and other health officials often don't see these tests. As we've discussed also, Section 8 only requires chemical companies to immediately submit to the EPA information they obtain that, quote, reasonably supports the conclusion, unquote, that a chemical, quote, presents a substantial risk of injury to health or the environment. So, Dr. Paulson, in your testimony, you say that TSCA has created a non-evidence-based system for chemical management. Can you explain what you mean by this?
In medicine, in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century now, we talk about practicing evidence-based medicine, that the decisions that we make should be based on rigorously collected information to inform those decisions. So I've taken that term that's used in medicine and applied it to a different arena. And what I'm suggesting here is that in terms of new chemicals, the companies are in essence penalized if they do research, because they're required then to report that research to EPA, and EPA might then use that research to make a decision the company doesn't want made. And in terms of the chemicals currently on the market, the quote that you just read in terms of the definition of substantial, that makes it very easy for companies to decide that it's not substantial. And I think the standard should be that companies need to disclose information that they have.
Thank you. The recent chemical spill in West Virginia, which we've also talked about, illustrates the problems created when chemical testing data isn't widely shared and available. On January 11th, the Centers for Disease Control told West Virginians that the water would be safe to drink at 1 part per million of the chemical of concern, MCHM. 4 days later, CDC said it obtained new animal studies leading it to recommend that pregnant women not drink the water at all. EPA told committee staff that the agency didn't have any studies on the chemical. A week after the chemical spill was discovered, Eastman, the chemical manufacturer, finally made public the summaries of several safety studies. Dr. Sass, how did this slow disclosure of the relevant safety studies affect your ability as a scientist to assess whether government was doing enough to protect public health?
Well, in the first few days, the public was completely blindsided and blinded with no information. The LD50, the lethal dose that kills 50% of test animals, which is very crude and not the kind of test we'd want to use to set a drinking water standard for a population, was the only test that seemed to be available. I found it on an MSDS, or a material safety data sheet. That's what CDC used initially. Later, they found a no-effect test in rodents, a 28-day rodent test, which they used. That's more informative. The problem with that test is that only the conclusions of the study were provided to the public, so there was no way to analyze those data or to reanalyze the data or to confirm that. It was a, trust us, we're the experts type of study from the industry, and that is wholly inappropriate for public health agencies, first responders, scientists, and the public to get any confirmation. So I think that it violated the public trust, and it put public interest groups in a blinded position, and it hamstrung the federal agencies considerably.
Let me just say that I think that it really affected the confidence of the West Virginians, both in the safety of their water and in the government's ability to respond. Thank you. I yield back.
Generally yields back her time, and we want to thank you all. We think it was a great hearing. I want to ask unanimous consent that all subcommittee members have 5 days to submit opening statements for the record without objections so ordered. Members will have 10 requisite days to submit questions for the record. So if you get follow-up with questions, if you would submit those back to us. I think it's very, very important because, as you see, we had a lot of active members very interested in this. I think it's safe to say that there is need for reform across the board. I think there's desire by the stakeholders and members. I think also the status quo is really not acceptable. I think people concur with that. I would just, cautionary note is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. as we try to work through this process. And with that, I want to thank my colleagues for attending, and I will now adjourn the hearing.